Hello, best friends, and welcome back to our safe little corner of the internet. It's so nice to see you again. Happy nearly Halloween. I hope that you've been having a wonderful week and that this video finds you super well. I know I say that all the time. I hope this video finds you really well because I mean it. I really hope that my videos do find you well. But I saw this meme earlier this week. I'll try and find it and put it on the screen now. And I just pictured like every time me popping up on your guys' subscription feeds, just randomly wanting to hang out like, hey, hope this video finds you well. And you guys being like, oh my God, stop finding me already, Liz. If you are new here and you have never seen my face pop up on your subscription feed, then hello, my name is Liz. It's so nice to meet you. And if you like talking about things like true crime and unsolved mysteries, then you should maybe hit subscribe so that you and me can hang out and chat about those things on a regular basis because FYI, we're best friends now. As usual, of course, we are joined by our other best friend, the real star of the show, Lily, who is once again rallying the Halloween spirit in her gorgeous little pumpkin scarf. And she's here to give us top-notch emotional support. And if today's video is anything like the last video, probably some weird, creepy demon ghost noises. Fun. So today we're talking about a girl named Martha Moxley, who was just 15 years old when she was brutally murdered the night before Halloween, otherwise known as Mischief Night in 1975. I personally had never heard of Martha's case before I started researching it, which is actually really surprising because firstly, this case is insane, and secondly, due to some of the high-profile individuals with a lot of power and money involved, it's gotten a whole lot of media attention over the years. We're talking books, movies, documentaries. So some of you guys, especially in the US, might have already heard about it. And Martha's case has gone through a whole lot of changes in the last 46 years. It's gone from unsolved to a cold case to a solved cold case to a not so solved cold case. Like basically just go grab some snacks and prepare yourself for some serious twists and turns, okay? So Martha was born on the 16th of August, 1960 to her parents, David and Dorothy Moxley. She had an older brother named John, and together the Moxleys made up a normal, happy, close-knit family of four. Dorothy, Martha's mother, said that one of the things that she and David hammered into their kids was always do and say the kindest thing in the kindest way, which is obviously just beautiful advice. And it seemed like this really sunk in because Martha was really well liked and overwhelmingly described as kind, bubbly, and friendly. Although there's a couple of stories here and there from her teenage years that suggest that Martha had a little bit of a wild streak in her, she did really well in school. She got almost straight A's and she played basketball and field hockey, just a really happy, well-adjusted teenager. This continued when Martha was 14 years old and the Moxley family made the massive move from Oakland, California, all the way across the country to Greenwich, Connecticut. And Martha's father, David, who was an accountant working for a prestigious international firm, was obviously doing very well in his career because the suburb that the Moxleys moved into, Belle Haven, just happened to be the richest neighborhood in the richest town in America at the time. Belle Haven was a 500-acre gated community that was filled with very fancy mansions on huge sprawling properties. It was very safe. There was only one way in and out equipped with a guard booth. And as well as this booth at the entrance, there were police booths spotted around the community and also private security policemen hired by the Belle Haven Association who patrolled the area in these nice pale blue cars 24/7. And all of this security was necessary because living in Belle Haven were some of the richest, most influential families in the country. As in the Moxleys' neighbors across the road, like one of the first neighbors that they met and became friendly with, straight up Kennedys, like the Kennedys. I mean, they weren't Kennedys by name. It was Sutton Skakel and his 7 children. But Sutton's sister was Ethel Skakel Kennedy, who was the widow of the US Senator and almost President Robert Kennedy, who was the brother of the fallen actual President John Kennedy. So They were Kennedys, if only by marriage. But even though that was the Skakel family's claim to fame, oh my God, we're Kennedys, the Skakels were actually richer than the Kennedys at this point in time because Rushton was running one of the biggest and wealthiest privately owned companies in America, Great Lakes Carbon. So these were the kind of families that the Moxleys were brushing shoulders with when they moved into Belle Haven, and they quickly all fit in really well. Dorothy and David would often host cocktail parties for the neighbors. Martha and John, of course, also made a ton of friends. Like just a year after moving, Martha was voted by her peers as the girl with the best personality. So it was all going super well. And then Thursday, the 30th of October, 1975 rolled around. It was the night before Halloween, and in Belle Haven, that meant it was Mischief Night, something that as an Australian, I had never heard of. So I, of course, did some research. And for those of you who are also unfamiliar, here's the lowdown. Mischief Night is also known as Devil's Night, Hacker's Night, Goosey Night. Like there's a ton of different names for it. And it's only practiced in certain neighborhoods. But basically, it's this night where kids and teenagers head out and stir up a bunch of trouble. Mostly harmless trouble, of course, like TPing trees and houses, throwing eggs, playing ding dong ditch, maybe if they're feeling extra extreme, stealing some porch furniture. And I'll be honest, I was a little bit disappointed to not find like a creepy origin story behind Mischief Night. It seems like it was more a bunch of kids that were like, yeah, trick or treat is great and all, but wouldn't it be fun if people didn't have the option to defend themselves by handing out candy? Honestly, the scariest things I found out about Mischief Night were Martha's case, and also that in some instances, the night has been known to get a little bit out of hand to the point where each year in places like Detroit, groups of people patrol the streets to make sure that the mischief makers don't commit acts of vandalism or set things on fire, like houses. So yeah, I'm personally glad that Mischief Night isn't a thing in Australia. I'm not really a fan of the whole concept, but Martha was. And that day she asked her mum Dorothy if she could go out and take part in the festivities. And Dorothy actually originally said no because Martha was supposed to be grounded for staying out late the weekend before. But over the afternoon, Martha begged and pleaded. She probably told her that she was ruining her life in that typical teenage power move. And Dorothy eventually gave in, like, fine, okay, you can go, but you need to be back by 10 p.m. sharp or there's going to be serious trouble. So Martha was, of course, overjoyed. She agreed to the curfew, and that night at about 7 p.m., she headed out with a couple of friends, Helen and Jeffrey, armed with a carton of eggs and some shaving cream. John, Martha's brother, also headed out for Mischief Night, and David, Martha's dad, was away on a business trip, so Dorothy settled in for a nice, peaceful night at home to herself. And then 10 p.m. rolled around, but there was no Martha. And then it was 10:30, and then it was 11, and John came home, but there was still no Martha. So Dorothy, probably super annoyed by now, said to John, look, can you just go out and have a look for your sister? Which he did. But then John came home a little while later and said that he couldn't find Martha. So Dorothy was like, you know what? Game on. She got out her little phone book and started calling around to all of Martha's friends, asking them if they had seen her, something that would obviously mortify Martha, and Dorothy knew that she would probably scream at her for later, but she didn't care anymore. She was equal parts worried and annoyed, and her worry was just making her more annoyed. I think that most mums will be familiar with this kind of feeling in this situation when you're worried about your child, but you're like, if this worry is all for nothing, then Lord, help them, because they are going to be in so much trouble. If you can't tell, I have definitely felt this way as a mother, and I am empathizing like hell with Dorothy right now. I know, Martha was in trouble, wasn't she? It's stormy outside right now, and Lily is a little bit scared, but that's okay, isn't it? We're going to get through this. Don't worry. I'll protect you. And so Dorothy was calling around to all of Martha's friends, and they're all telling her the same thing, like, no, Mrs. Moxley, I haven't seen Martha, but I'm sure she's fine. You know, it's Mischief Night. It's kind of the night to rebel and stay out late. But Dorothy kept calling around, and at about midnight, she got through to Helen, one of the friends who Martha had left the house with earlier that night. And Helen also told her that no, she didn't know where Martha was, but she did say that the last time she saw Martha was at about 9:30 p.m. at the Skakel house. Yeah, the Kennedys across the road that we spoke about earlier. There had been some kind of party going on there, and Helen had last seen Martha outside the house with Rushton Skakel's 17-year-old son, Tommy Skakel, flirting and kissing and quote-unquote falling together behind the fence near the Skakel's pool. So Dorothy was kind of taken aback by all of this because she didn't know that Martha even knew any of the Skakel kids, let alone that she was romantically involved with one of them. So she called the Skakel house, but she couldn't speak to her friend, Tommy's dad, Rushton, because he was away on a hunting trip, and she instead spoke with his daughter, 18-year-old Julie Skakel, and Julie told her that Martha wasn't there and that Tommy was asleep in bed. But it was getting later and later, and Dorothy wasn't annoyed anymore. She was just plain worried. She called the Skakel house a couple more times, and when Tommy did eventually drag himself out of bed to speak with her, he just said that he had no idea where the hell Martha was. And so at about 3:45 a.m. in the early morning hours of the 31st of October, Dorothy called the Greenwich police and reported Martha as missing. And they pretty much immediately began searching for Martha and continued to do so through the night. In the morning at about 10 a.m., Dorothy walked across the road to the Skakel house to see if she could get any more information out of Tommy, but Tommy's younger brother, 15-year-old Michael Skakel, answered the door. Remember, there's 7 of these kids. So Dorothy asked Michael if he had seen Martha, and he said no, he hadn't seen her. But Dorothy saw there was this camper van or RV on the front lawn and asked Michael if she could have a look inside. Maybe Martha had fallen asleep in there, I guess. And Michael was really helpful and polite. He let Dorothy inside, but unfortunately, there was no Martha, so Dorothy went back home to wait for any news. And a couple of hours later, at about 12:30 p.m., the search was still in full swing. The police were out searching for Martha, the neighbours were out searching for Martha, and a distraught Dorothy was at home, surrounded by friends who were comforting her and assuring her that Martha would probably walk through the front door at any minute. But then the opposite happened. One of Martha's friends that Dorothy had called the night before, Sheila, had been walking towards the Moxley house to check if Martha had made it home okay when she noticed something in their side yard. And what she originally thought was a sleeping bag turned out to be Martha's body, lying face down under a tree, literally just 200 yards from her own front door. And after, Sheila, who was of course completely hysterical, ran to the house to break the news, and the police were called to the scene. Martha's head and neck were just covered in so much blood that you couldn't even really tell what color her hair was anymore. And when the officers searched the area and followed a trail of blood across the yard, they found the murder weapon, a golf club which was laying in pieces not far from where Martha's body laid. An autopsy would later reveal that whoever had killed Martha had done so with over a dozen blows to the head that were so brutal that the club had shattered. So this was a clear case of overkill. The entire right-hand side of Martha's skull had been crushed in, and any one of several of these blows would have been enough to kill her. The killer had then used one of the pieces of the golf club to stab Martha right through the neck, about an hour after she was already dead from the devastating blows she had suffered to her head. Unfortunately, this piece of the club with the handle was missing from the scene, so there were no fingerprints to be found. Looking at the blood evidence, it was determined that the first blow came from behind while Martha was walking up her driveway. The killer then dragged her a short distance across the front yard behind a tree where they continued the attack. And the killer had then either left and then come back about an hour later, or just kind of hung around there while Martha was laying there bleeding. They then used the broken shaft of the club to stab her through the neck before dragging her to the side of the house under the tree where her body had been found. While Martha's body had been found with her jeans and underwear pulled down, there was no evidence found during the autopsy that any sexual assault had taken place. Police quickly determined that the club used in the murder was a 6-iron that had come from a rare set of Tony Penner golf clubs. And so when they started going around and questioning the neighbours, they were of course asking them if they owned a set of these clubs. And while a lot of the families around did own golf clubs, because I guess rich people love golf, none of the families owned this rare set of Tony Penners that the club used to murder Martha had come from, except one. the Skakels, and their set was only missing one club, the 6 iron. So it wasn't looking good for Tommy Skakel, right? Not only had he been the last person seen with Martha the night of her murder, but the golf club used to kill her had literally come from his house. He was naturally, instantly the prime suspect. So police, of course, brought him in for questioning, but Tommy said the last time he had seen Martha was at about 9:30 p.m. when she was leaving his house, at which point he had gone upstairs to work on a homework assignment and then watch part of a movie with the family's live-in tutor, Kenneth Littleton. But police were, of course, still suspicious. They were pretty certain they had their guy, but Tommy's story did clash with Martha's time of death, which had been placed at about 10 p.m., half an hour after Tommy said he had last seen her. So they gave him a couple of polygraph tests. And while the first one was inconclusive, Tommy actually passed the second test. Michael, Tommy's 15-year-old brother, was also questioned because he was at the house that night as well, but he said the last time he saw Martha was with Tommy at about 9:30 p.m. that night as he and some friends drove away from the house to go to his cousin's. He had then returned home at about 11:20 p.m. that night and gone straight to bed. So he could neither really confirm or deny Tommy's story because he wasn't there. In the end, police just seemed to kind of lose interest in Tommy Skakel and focus their attention on trying to find other suspects, which is weird, right? Even though Tommy had passed that second polygraph, he was still the last person that had been seen with Martha while she was still alive, and the weapon used in her murder had still come from his house. But it does make sense when you take a closer look at the Skakel family themselves. For decades, the Skakel had easily been one of the most powerful and wealthy families living in Belle Haven, which is saying a lot. Sadly, 3 years earlier in 1972, Rushton Skakel's wife, Anne, had passed away after a long battle with cancer, and Rushton and the couple's 7 children, ranging in ages at the time from 6 to 16, were left to fend for themselves. After Anne's death, Rushton was just overcome with this debilitating grief and made an effort to deal with this grief by burying himself in his work and also consuming huge amounts of alcohol. And when it came to the children, he varied from being emotionally, verbally, physically abusive to just being plain absent, constantly away on work trips and relying on hired help to raise the children. So the Skakel children basically lost their mother and their father in one foul swoop, and they all dealt with this in different but mostly negative ways. It was said that the kids were just given limited amounts of money and were left unsupervised a lot of the time, so they acted out. Right? A few of them had scrapes with law enforcement for mostly minor stuff like shoplifting and vandalism. But Rushton was like, oh no, I need to keep this under wraps and keep the police on my side. So he quite literally put them on his payroll. If any Greenwich police officers were low on cash, they would do odd jobs for the family while they were off duty, like drive them around or act as security at their parties and that kind of thing. And it wasn't an odd occurrence for these officers to be at the Skakel house just chilling out, eating lunch or whatever, even during the investigation into Martha's murder, where Tommy, Rushton's son, was the prime suspect, because that's not a conflict of interest, right? But essentially, because Rushton had been laying down all that groundwork for years before Martha was murdered to be friendly with the police were willing to be extra considerate to the family during the investigation. Police never even bothered to obtain a search warrant for the Skakel residence, missing the opportunity to search for potentially vital evidence like, I don't know, bloody clothes if Tommy had been the one to murder Martha. They didn't even get their hands on the remainder of the golf set that the murder weapon had come from, because Rushton told them that he would get them and bring them into the station, but then later told them, sorry, I can't find the rest of those damn clubs. Also, one of the younger Skakel children, Stephen, told one of his friends on the school bus on the morning of October 31st, we're talking hours before Martha's body had been found, that he had heard her screaming in his backyard the previous night. This friend of Stephen's then told her mum, who told the police, but the police never spoke with Stephen. Instead, they spoke with Rushton, who told them that he would speak with Stephen, and just like magic, little Stephen changed his story, saying that he had heard Martha laughing that night, not screaming, and he wasn't even sure that it was her. So even though his son was the prime suspect in Martha's murder, Rushton Skakel was practically running the investigation when it came to his family, and the Greenwich police were just letting it happen. But I mean, they were between a rock and a hard place, right? They had literally a whole neighborhood of very rich, powerful families demanding that they catch this killer, but all of the evidence was pointing towards the killer coming from the most rich and the most powerful family of them all. Like, I'm not jealous. That's a real pickle. Hey, it's a real pickle, Lil. Right. Was there more thunder? I swear the sky isn't falling. It's okay. We'll get through this, okay? It's all right. In January 1976, police did attempt to access Tommy's medical and school records, and Rushton did originally grant them permission. But after a conversation with Tommy's headmaster and a couple of attorneys, he then rushed down to the station to recant his permission and promptly cut off contact with them and denied them any further access to him or his family. So the police were desperately scrambling, trying to find another suspect who wasn't Tommy Skakel. They looked very closely at another neighbor of the Moxleys, a man named Ed Hammond, mostly based on the fact that he had a drinking problem and also that from his bedroom window, he had a direct view of the spot where Martha was murdered. And they went really hard on Ed. They were searching through his trash. They took him down to the station and questioned him without reading him his rights. They took hair and fingernail samples from him, like going way harder on him than they ever had on Tommy. But when Ed passed a polygraph test, they lost interest and moved on. For a while, they very enthusiastically pursued the theory that Martha had been killed by some random drifter, even though this would mean that this drifter had gotten past the guard booth at the entrance of Belle Haven, broken into the Skakel residence just to steal a golf club and nothing else, and then just happened to be walking past the Moxley house just as Martha was walking up her driveway. And then after brazenly murdering Martha with no real clear motive, he then disappeared from Belle Haven without causing any more trouble. But the person they went after the hardest was someone else in the Skakel house that night, Kenneth Littleton, the Skakel's private live-in tutor. Kenneth was a 23-year-old teacher and coach from the very exclusive Brunswick School in Greenwich, where some of the Skakel boys themselves had attended. And Kenneth was very well respected and liked. He was a great teacher, so Rushton Skakel had snatched him up as a tutor for his children, probably also to kind of take on a sort of babysitter role because the Skakel children were, as we mentioned, a tad wild, and he wanted someone to keep them in line when he was away on business trips. Coincidentally, Kenneth had started in this new live-in tutor role for the Skakels the day of the murder, just hours before Martha was murdered. So while all of these kids, including Martha and her friends, had been downstairs partying and drinking and all of that, according to Kenneth, he had been upstairs getting settled, unpacking while watching TV. And I get why the police went so hard after Kenneth. He was in the house that night where Martha was last seen and where the murder weapon had come from. And also on the down low, I feel like Rushton Skakel probably strongly encouraged them to go after Kenneth because it took the attention off of his son, Tommy. But this was another theory that just didn't make any sense. Why would Kenneth, a highly regarded and well-liked teacher on the first night of his employment at the Skakel house, randomly decide to go and kill one of the neighbor kids? Also, Kenneth's movements and locations that night were able to be confirmed by the other household staff. Unlike Tommy, who had already been caught out in a lie about that homework assignment that he said he had worked on after Martha left, because when police spoke with his teacher, they found out that that assignment never even existed. Tommy had just made it up. Kenneth did fail multiple polygraph tests though, so police hounded him endlessly over the next few years. And not only did Rushton Skakel fire Kenneth in early 1976, just months after Martha was killed, but he went on to be fired from multiple other positions because police would continually turn up to question him while he was on the job, hurting his work performance and obviously drawing attention to the fact that he was a murder suspect. As a result of all of this, Kenneth's life kind of fell apart. And by the end of 1976, he had been diagnosed as a manic depressive. He was a heavy drinker, and amongst other things, he had apparently stolen lawn ornaments and then buried them in his backyard. So he was clearly going through some issues there, and he was arrested for grand larceny, breaking and entering, and burglary. Within 5 years of Martha's murder, this list of crimes would grow to include things like shoplifting, assault, and battery, and also multiple DUIs. So this once bright young man, full of potential, was obviously no longer able to get work as a teacher, and he had trouble holding down multiple part-time jobs and ended up working on a loading dock in Nantucket. Side note to those who know, is it in Nantucket or on Nantucket? Because clearly it's an island, but I looked it up and Google just could not tell me the correct way to put it. So now I really want to know, in or on? Please tell me, or I probably will lose sleep over this. Back in Greenwich, despite being under tremendous amounts of pressure from the residents of Belle Haven to solve this case and conducting about 500 interviews, the police were no closer to finding Martha's murderer. No one was arrested, no new leads were coming in, and the case eventually went cold. That is until 16 years later, in 1991, when William Kennedy Smith, yes, another Kennedy, because this case is just swimming with them. Anyway, William Kennedy Smith was charged with rape in 1991, and eventually he was acquitted. But during the court process, a rumor came up that William had been at the Skakel house the night that Martha was murdered and that he might have been involved. As William's case was quite high profile, these rumors, while they were never proven, gained quite a bit of attention from the public. Everyone was like, wait, why was Martha's murder never solved? And this public scrutiny, intensified by multiple books and movies based on Martha's case that were released over the next few years, ended up with the investigation into Martha's murder being reopened. And of course, investigators' very first move was to take a closer look at the Skakel family. Just kidding. No, they went after Kenneth Littleton. Again, of course. They actually set up this big sting operation with Kenneth's wife at the time, where she wore a wire and tried to get him to confess to the crime. When this didn't work, they interrogated him intensely over the course of 4 days without a lawyer present. But this also didn't work. It was almost like Kenneth wasn't the murderer. So weird. Meanwhile, Martha's case was featured in a segment on Unsolved Mysteries, and in conjunction with this, Martha's parents, Dorothy and David, put a reward out for $100,000 for any information leading to the arrest of Martha's killer, and a whole ton of new tips came in which kind of changed the course of the investigation. See, a number of these tips came from former students of the Elan School in Maine, which was essentially a residential school where parents would send their troublesome teenagers to receive treatment for their mental health and substance abuse issues. Side note, it was terrible. Serious atrocities occurred there, and there's multiple documentaries on it if you're interested. Anyway, these former students said that years ago in the late 70s, they had all heard the same teenage boy blurt out that he had been the one that had killed Martha Moxley, that he had done so with a golf club, and the kicker, that he was going to get away with it because he was a Kennedy. The thing is, Tommy Skakel never attended the Elan School, but do you know who did? His younger brother, Michael Skakel. This came about because back when Michael was only 13 years old and his mother died and his father all but abandoned him and his siblings, he had turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain. And this turned into a raging substance abuse problem, which led to him being arrested for drunk driving. And it was at this point that his father, Rushton, had had enough. He enrolled him in the Elan School for 2 years between 1978 and 1980 so that they could sort him out. So police were now asking themselves, of course, had they been looking at the wrong Skakel brother all of this time? Had they perhaps ruined Kenneth Littleton's life for no reason? And then in 1995, a document known as the Sutton Report was leaked to the press that was just groundbreaking and quite literally pulled the rug out from underneath the Skakel family's feet. This report had been compiled by some private investigators Rushton Skakel had hired from a company called Sutton Associates around the same time that the investigation into Martha's murder had been reopened to hopefully clear the cloud of suspicion that had followed his son, Tommy Skakel, all of these years. The Sutton investigation took place over nearly 4 years, and it was very, very thorough, probably costing Rushton an obscene amount of money. All of the Skakel children were questioned, some of them while under hypnosis to try and recover any forgotten memories from that night, and a former FBI expert was even brought in to compile a profile of Martha's killer. But this report was never completed or released because once Rushton saw some of the information in it, he promptly paid Sutton Associates for their work and told them that he would not be requiring their services any longer. He then buried the report without handing over any of the findings to the police or the Moxleys, and it became blatantly obvious why years later when the report got leaked, because instead of clearing the suspicion around Tommy, the information uncovered by these investigators was incredibly damning to Tommy and also Michael. It turned out that both brothers had lied to the police about their whereabouts and actions that night. According to the report, Tommy told the PIs that what he had told the police in 1975, that he had last seen Martha at about 9:30 p.m., wasn't true. He now said that at 9:30, he and Martha had gone outside and engaged in sexual activities for about half an hour. So Tommy was now placing himself with Martha, having sex just literally a handful of minutes before she was murdered. And Michael, while the first part of his story stayed the same, that he had last seen Martha with Tommy at about 9:30 p.m. before he went to his cousin's house, the PIs stated in the report that they found numerous reasons, including witness accounts from those present at the house that night, to be doubtful that Michael had ever gone to his cousin's like he claimed. Michael's story then changed from this point. He originally told police that he had returned home from his cousin's at about 11:30 p.m. and gone straight to sleep, but he now said that he hadn't gone to sleep. He had actually gone to Martha's house, climbed a tree outside her bedroom window and masturbated there before returning home at about 12:30 a.m. If you're feeling a little bit iffy about these stories, you are definitely not alone. I mean, why were these two brothers, after all of these years, suddenly changing their stories in such incriminating ways? It's actually been suggested that with all of the advancements in forensic DNA technology that were happening at the time, the Skakel family were spooked that with Martha's case being reopened, there would be DNA found on her body or her clothes or around the crime scene that would lead the police back to Tommy and or Michael. And so they had these stories carefully crafted by the family's lawyers to offer semi-innocent explanations for Tommy or Michael's DNA being present and to cast reasonable doubt should either of them ever go to trial. I think the crew from Sutton Associates also felt that Tommy and Michael's new alibis were a little bit off, and they went so far as to offer their own very detailed hypothetical theory as to what had happened to Martha based on all of the details they had uncovered. They suggested that after seeing Martha go off to mess around with his older brother, Tommy, Michael had become extremely jealous and he had followed Martha home and murdered her in a drug and alcohol-fueled fit of rage. When Michael then came back home covered in blood, a number of people in the house, including Tommy and Kenneth Littleton, had gone about helping him cover up his crime. And so investigators suggested that the reason Tommy was able to pass that polygraph test was because he wasn't lying for himself. He was lying for Michael. In the end, these private investigators were straight up ballsier than the police because despite most likely having Rushton Skakel breathing down their necks, wanting them to pin the murder on anyone else, the main conclusion they came to was that both Tommy and Michael had lied to authorities and that Kenneth Littleton definitely knew something about what had happened that night, but for some reason was holding back, which puts a whole different light on how Kenneth's life fell apart in the years following Martha's murder. It wasn't because he had had anything to do with Martha's death. He was probably just dealing with the crushing amount of pressure from the Skakel family to stay quiet about what he knew. But in 1998, he did come forward and he testified as part of a reinvestigation of the case after being granted immunity. And he was joined by over 50 other witnesses who testified against Michael, including those former classmates who said that they had heard Michael admit to murdering Martha. This investigation lasted 18 months and concluded on the 9th of January with an arrest warrant being issued for Michael Skakel for the second-degree murder of Martha Moxley. Michael turned himself into authorities later that day and was released on a $500,000 bail. Even though Michael was only 15 years old at the time of the murder, it was determined that he would be tried as an adult, not a juvenile, and his trial commenced in May 2002. Michael was now 41 years old, the same age that Martha would have been had she not been murdered nearly 27 years earlier. He had worked through his drug and alcohol addictions, and he had been sober since his 20s. He was a former ski champion, he had been married and had a child. He lived a full, privileged life. While the prosecution had no physical evidence to present to link Michael to Martha's murder, they did have those 50-odd witnesses who were able to testify about the incriminating statements Michael had made over the years and some things that were seen and heard at the Skakel house the night of the murder. Also, despite arguments from Michael's lawyers, entries from Martha's diary were submitted as testimony in court, and these entries really seemed to support this theory that Sutton Associates had put forward years earlier, that Tommy and Michael had been vying over Martha's affections, and that after seeing Martha go off with Tommy, Michael had gone into a blind rage and killed her. Michael's trial lasted for 5 weeks, and after a jury deliberated for about 4 days, they came back and delivered a verdict of guilty. After Michael then gave a tearful, muddled statement packed with biblical references, insisting that he was innocent, he was then sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Michael's defense, of course, then launched a big series of appeals, the general tone of which was that Michael didn't receive a fair trial. They said that he should have been tried as a juvenile, that the jury was biased against him because the prosecution called him a spoiled brat, and also that Michael didn't receive adequate representation because his original lawyer was rubbish and got so caught up in the celebrity of defending a Kennedy that he kind of forgot to present evidence backing up Michael's alibi that he was at his cousin's at the time that Martha was murdered, even though, like we said, there were multiple witnesses that claimed that Michael never went to his cousin's house that night. In 2006, Michael's lawyers also handed over the names of 2 men that Toby Bryant, who happens to be the cousin of the late basketball star Kobe Bryant, claimed that he had been hanging out with at the Skakel house that night. Tony said that he had heard one of these guys, who happened to have a huge crush on Martha, say that they were going to go and get a girl caveman style before they ran off with one of the Skakel's Tony Pennant golf clubs that were allegedly just scattered around the backyard at this time. Tony's testimony didn't really seem to hold much weight though, and he himself later said that his statements had been quote unquote blown out of proportion. But in November 2013, after serving just 11 years in prison, a judge at Stamford Superior Court ruled that Michael be released on bail based on this argument that he did not receive adequate representation at his trial. Michael's conviction was then reinstated in 2016 by the Connecticut Supreme Court, who said that Michael's representation was adequate. But in 2018, the same court then reversed their own decision and once again vacated Michael's conviction. So now the prosecution's only real option was a retrial, but on the 30th of October 2020, exactly 45 years to the day since Martha's murder, they announced that for right now, this wasn't going to happen. The chief state attorney explained that of their original 51 witnesses, 17 had passed away, and there was no new forensic evidence that had been uncovered since the original trial. So they felt that they would not be able to prove that Michael was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's where this case stands as of today. Sadly, Martha's father, David Moxley, passed away in 1988 from a sudden heart attack, having no idea who had murdered his daughter. murder. Dorothy Moxley, who is now 88 years old, says that she still believes that Michael Skakel is guilty. But she also says that she doesn't feel the need for Michael to spend any more time in prison, that just him being found guilty gave her all the sense of justice that she needed. In fact, if you listen to her and John, Martha's brother, speak about Michael and the rest of the Skakel children, you mostly get the feeling that they just feel overwhelming pity for these kids that got limitless money and blank checks in place of the love and attention and security that they really needed and craved from their father after their mother's death. So it's time for final thoughts, and I'm a little bit all over the place, if I'm honest, but what else is new? As frustrating as it is that for now, at least, Michael isn't going to be retried, I do think that it's the right decision. There just simply isn't enough evidence against him to guarantee a conviction. But I really do hope that new evidence does eventually come up and that Martha's murder doesn't go unsolved forever. I feel incredibly sorry for Kenneth Littleton. After he finally testified in court in 1998, Kenneth seemed really relieved, like this was a huge weight that had been lifted off his shoulders. But it wasn't long after this that he made an attempt to end his own life. So he was clearly still going through a whole lot of pain and torment, and I don't think he ever really truly recovered. I know the things he did and the turn his life took after Martha's murder did make him appear even guiltier to the police and the public, but I feel like it's more likely that he knew what happened to Martha and couldn't deal with the immense guilt and pressure he was under, most likely by the Skakels, to keep his mouth shut. Like, there is no doubt in my mind that if Martha's killer was one of the Skakels and Kenneth knew, they would have put the fear of God into him, that they would ruin his life if he told the truth. And he would have believed them. This was the Skakels, one of the richest, most powerful families in the country at the time. But sadly, it seems like Kenneth didn't stand a chance. Either way, his life was ruined. One thing I can't get past is Tommy and Michael's news stories for that night, especially Tommy's, because it doesn't make any sense. Firstly, when Martha spoke about Tommy in her diary and all the moves that he made on her, it was quite clear that she wasn't interested. Even that night, Martha's friends that were with her said that she was shooting down his advancements all night. So why all of a sudden would she change her mind and agree to engage in sexual acts with him? Outside, on the lawn, in the backyard of all places. Like I did say in the beginning, Martha did have a bit of a wild streak, but that night she was stone cold sober and it was freezing cold. So if she did change her mind and agree, why didn't she and Tommy go inside the house or in the RV out the front where the Skakel boys would usually take girls? It just doesn't make any sense. And Michael's news story of going to Martha's house that night and doing naughty things in her tree not only explains away any of his DNA being at the crime scene, but also had him walking that same path that Martha's killer would have walked, maybe in case any witnesses came forward and claimed that they had seen him there that night. Michael has continuously proclaimed his innocence over all of these years, and during his trial and appeals, his lawyer actually argued multiple times that his brother, Tommy, was most likely to have been the one that killed Martha, even though Tommy actually appeared in court testifying on Michael's behalf. Like, that is cold. As usual, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this case. Do you think Michael killed Martha? And if so, do you think justice was served? I found out that apparently a lot of people do feel this way because had he been tried as a juvenile, he would have served about 11 years, which is the amount of time he was behind bars. Or do you think that Michael is innocent and that someone else killed Martha? Do you think it was someone in the Skakel house that night, maybe Tommy or even Kenneth? Let's continue this hangout in the comments down below. Tell me how you feel and we can all discuss. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to let me know by giving it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, remember to subscribe so that we can be best friends forever. Lily, you're going to come say bye? Hey, has the storm stopped? It's all done now. I told you you wouldn't die. It's done. You're going to say bye? They're just there. Yeah, they're just there. They're just there. Just, okay, that's fine. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and Lily. We appreciate it so much as always. I hope you have a wonderful week and a great Halloween. And of course, me and Lily will be counting down the hours until we find you again in the next video. Bye.